This is Becoming Antifragile with I.J. Makan. Each week I read a book and highlight the actionable wisdom within. To become anti-fragile, you must strengthen your mind and live with conviction. Let's get into it. The discerning man straightens his mind, which is fickle and unsteady, difficult to guard and restrain, as the skilled fletcher straightens the shaft of the arrow. As the fish, taken out of its watery home and thrown on land, thrashes around, so does the mind tremble while freeing itself from the dominion of the evil one. The mind is unstable and flighty. It wanders wherever it desires. Therefore, it is good to control the mind. A disciplined mind brings happiness. The mind is incomprehensible and exceedingly subtle. It wanders wherever it desires. Therefore, let the wise aspirant watch over the mind. A well-guarded mind brings happiness. Those who control the mind which wanders afar, solitary, incorporeal, and which resides in the inner cavern of the heart, will liberate themselves from the shackles of the evil one. He whose mind is not steady, who is ignorant of the true Dhamma, whose tranquility is ruffled, the wisdom of such a man does not come to fullness. Fear has he none whose mind is not defiled by passion, whose heart is devoid of hatred, who has surpassed the dichotomy of good and evil, and who is vigilant, knowing the corporeal body to be fragile as an earthen jar, and fortifying the mind like a citadel. Let the wise man fight the evil one with the sword of wisdom. He should now protect what he has won without attachment. An ill-directed mind does greater harm to the self than a hater does to another hater, or an enemy to another enemy. Neither father nor mother nor any other kindred can confer greater benefit than does the well-directed mind. This is an excerpt from the Dhammapada. The Dhammapada is a collection of sayings of the Buddha. And the Dhammapada, the word, is a compound of Dhamma, which means eternal truth, and Pada, which means the foot. So you'll notice that in just that section that we were reading, there's so much emphasis on the importance of controlling your mind, controlling what you allow into the mind, and freeing yourself from what the Buddha calls the evil one, or in Pali, which is the original language, the evil one is called Mara. And so when you're reading this, you start to notice that right from the beginning, the Buddha says, look, the mind is unstable and flighty. It wanders wherever it desires. Therefore, it is good to control the mind. A disciplined mind brings happiness. That is 100% accurate, because when your mind is undisciplined, when you allow your mind to wander wherever it pleases, and you don't take hold of what you allow into your mind, as we've talked about in all the previous episodes, it will end up controlling you. And in the last episode we did with Epictetus in 007, right? Epictetus' main point was, you cannot let the outside, the external things to you, control what happens in your mind. You have to become the master of your mind. You have to be somebody who controls what you think, what you do, by controlling your mind. Now, because the Dhammapada is a collection of sayings, the sayings of Buddha, there's actually quite a lot of things that I wanted to talk about, but obviously that would require us being here for a long time. So what I've done instead is put this into sections, right? And one of the first things that I wanted to talk about was death, and specifically these two quotes. The first one is, most people never realize that all of us here shall one day perish, but those who realize that truth settle their quarrels peacefully. You see right here that the Buddha is saying the majority of people don't realize that they're going to die. And we know this because most people live as if they will never die. They continue to do things and never reflect on their impending death. And by not doing that, they make decisions that later on they will regret when they are much closer to death. They end up placing a premium on things that are not important for the long run, but would bring them pleasure at this point in time, at this very moment. End up making short-term minded decisions. And we know this from episode 002, Leo Tolstoy. One of the problems that Leo Tolstoy had was that he got to the age of 50, where he had accomplished basically what many can only hope and dream to accomplish. He had a 16,200 acre estate, 300 horses. And on top of that, he had a family, he had kids. He was revered by his aristocratic peers. He was one of the most influential men. And at age 50, Leo Tolstoy goes, "What is all this that I have done? All these things that I have done will not survive past my death." He ends up talking about how the rich and the poor, the wise and the fool, they're all going to die. Right? So he has this quote, "Everything in the world, both folly and wisdom, wealth and poverty, joy and sorrow, all is vanity and emptiness. A man dies, nothing remains. And this is absurd." And for Tolstoy, the absurdity leads him down a path of him trying to figure out what is the meaning of this life. And he realizes that the way he had been living his life, he had been living a sensuous life filled with overindulgence, food, with women, whatever it was. He was living a life of overindulgence. And then he ends up realizing that the people who were most happy were the ones who had the least amount of things, right? These were the peasant class. And for Tolstoy, he says, look, maybe the reason I thought my life was meaningless is because I was actually living my life wrong. And so when I asked the question, is there meaning in this life? I was asking myself, but the man in the mirror was answering that there was no meaning because I was living a life that was not worth living. But if I lived a life that was worth living, like the peasant class, then my life would have meaning. Because for them, they embraced suffering. They lived a life of discipline. They lived a life worthy of the calling of life. So he ends up saying, the wise man seeks death all his life, and for this reason, death is not terrifying to him. And for Tolstoy, that was big because death was absolutely terrifying to Tolstoy. And so when we go back to the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, most people never realize that they're going to die, even though it only takes a short reflection to say, my life will end. There is no permanence in this life. But the issue is the way our world functions, the way in which we emphasize what the purpose of life is in the West. Is this idea that you're going to live that's going to last forever. And so the Buddha says, not in the sky, not in the middle of the ocean, not even in the cave of a mountain, should one seek refuge. For there exists no place in the world where one will not be overpowered by death. And I think that quote is relevant specifically for today and this day and age because we have experts wanting to live forever, wanting to extend the life beyond what is natural. From a science perspective, it's interesting. It's interesting to see, can we extend the human life beyond what we currently know as the limit? Say it's 100. Is it possible to extend this life for 100 more years? And that's all interesting. But the reason people are into the extension of human life, and specifically this field of longevity, is because nobody wants to die. Because when you die, there's nothing in this world that you've done that you can take with you. You cannot take your money. You cannot take your designer clothing. You cannot take your wife with you. You cannot take your children with you. You cannot take the prizes that you've won with you. You cannot take the degrees that you've won. You cannot take the company you've built with you. Just as you were born naked, you will die naked with nothing. And that thought scares many people. And so the Buddha says, knowing the corporeal body to be fragile as an earthen vessel and fortifying the mind like a citadel, let the wise man fight the evil with the sword of wisdom. He should now protect what he has won without attachment. You and I both know that death is something to not be afraid of, right? You and I know that death is something that is inevitable for all of us. And so we've faced it. And we read these books because there are the sages who've gone before us who have paved a way in how to think about these things and how to think about the impermanence of life. And it is up to us to reflect on this and implement it into our lives and walk the path. The Buddha says one path leads to worldly gain and honor. Quite another path leads to nirvana. Having realized this truth, let not the monk, the true follower of the Enlightened One, yearn for homage from others, but let him cultivate serenity of mind and dispassion. So he's saying here, there are two paths in this world. One is to chase material possessions, material gains, and the other is the path towards nirvana, towards eternal bliss. And he says, you cannot live both of these lives. You cannot chase the worldly possessions and also chase after the path of nirvana because they are in contradiction to each other. And this is very similar to what Jesus says in Matthew 6:24. So Jesus says, No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And the point that Jesus is making is a point about priority of values. You cannot place a strong emphasis on chasing material possessions while at the same time trying to prioritize spiritual and ethical values. Not that they are in complete contradiction, because there's nothing immoral about riches, but the point that Jesus makes is you need to prioritize the spiritual and ethical values over the pursuit of material wealth. And this is something that in the Dhammapada, it's repeated over and over and over again, where in the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, look, to be on the path to nirvana, if you are at the same time seeking after excessive wealth and overindulgence of anything, he says, you are not somebody who will attain nirvana, because your mind is in conflict and your loyalties are divided. And moreover, the serenity of your mind is in jeopardy when you focus and place a strong emphasis on material possessions, because you are always going to be thinking about whether you're going to lose this money, whether you're going to lose your house, whether you're going to lose whatever you've accumulated. And so this distraction will end up preventing you from attaining nirvana. And another quote from the Dhammapada, he says, even though a person be dressed in fine clothes, if he develops tranquility, is quiet, self-disciplined, resolute, and practices celibacy, and abstains from injuring all other beings, he is indeed a Brahmin, an ascetic, and a monk. Here now it seems that what the Buddha is saying is you could have the wealth, but if this person has developed tranquility, is self-disciplined, practices celibacy, abstains from injuring all other beings, he says he is a Brahmin. And a Brahmin here just means a holy one, somebody on the path to nirvana. And it sounds like a contradiction, but in context, it's not, because what the Buddha has been saying here the whole time is the difference between a man who's wealthy and practices developing his tranquility, developing serenity, being self-disciplined, is that the one who's self-disciplined will not overindulge in anything. Even if he has the wealth, his wealth, he will use it for good. He will not be attached to his wealth. But the man that you don't want to be is somebody who has wealth and who's completely attached to his wealth, because that man, he says, will not be able to attain nirvana. And so the question to ask yourself is, how attached are you to your material possessions? Are you someone whose mind is constantly burdened by worldly possessions? And if so, the Buddha says you must take care to become detached with these things, right? You must not be attached to these things, because in you being attached, it is what's preventing you from living a happy life. So he says, awake, be not heedless, follow the truth. He who embarks upon the path of truth lives happily in this world and in the hereafter. And again, the path of the truth is living a life that's not overindulgent. You have self-discipline. You have cultivated your mind to be at peace. When you do these things, then, he says, look, you will be happy. So then the question is, well, then how do you do this? How do you get to the point where your mind is strong, where your mind is the master? For the Buddha, the starting point is to cast away the evil one, or in the Pali, it's Mara, M-A-R-A. And so in the excerpt that we read, right, he says, as fish taken out of its watery home and thrown on land thrashes around, so does the mind tremble while freeing itself from the dominion of Mara, or the evil one. The mind is unstable and flighty. It wanders wherever it desires. Therefore, it is good to control the mind. A disciplined mind brings happiness. It's clear that it's not easy to take hold of your mind, to control your mind, because when you are in the midst of reining in your mind, because your mind is so unstable and flighty and it wants to wander everywhere, he says, it's like a fish when it's taken out the water and it's just flapping around. Your mind feels like it's going to explode. It feels like it's getting out of control. It is through this, right? It is through this discomfort that you actually can cross the threshold of controlling your mind. So one of the practices within the monastic tradition that they do, specifically in the Buddhist monastic tradition, is to sit cross-legged, to have your hands on your legs, and to not move your body, right? To not scratch, to not be distracted by these things. Because in you cultivating this sort of discipline, you are able to get the mind to overcome the body, right? And that is extremely important. And one of the interesting things about the Buddha, and the reason why he says the Mara right? You have to overcome the Mara, and it comes up over and over and over again. And you'll see that later on when the Buddha, before he attained nirvana, he was trying to figure out how to attain this, right? Prior to the Buddha attaining nirvana, they're known as the Bodhisattva. And so if you're ever reading any sort of like Buddhist commentaries and they say the Bodhisattva, that means they're referring to the Buddha before he reaches his enlightenment. And so Siddhartha Gautama, when he's very young, he's sitting under a tree and his dad is plowing the field for a particular festival. He ends up having a transcendental meditative experience. And so as he gets older and he's trying to figure out how to attain nirvana, he does all these extremes, right? So first of all, he tries to do the most extreme ascetic practices by not eating, by not drinking water. And what ends up happening is he nearly dies. And so he says, look, actually, it seems like even though I've been practicing all these things for multiple years, I haven't actually gotten any closer to nirvana. So I must be doing something incorrect here, or I'm doing something that's not working. And in him reflecting, the Buddha says in the Majjhima Nikaya, he says, I thought of a time when my Sakyan father was working and I was sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree, quite secluded from the sensual desires, secluded from the unprofitable things I had entered upon, and abided in the first meditation, which accompanied my thinking and exploring with happiness and pleasure, born of seclusion. I thought, might that be the way to enlightenment? Then following up that memory, there came the recognition that this was the way to enlightenment. And so from here, he ends up finding a fig tree and sitting under the fig tree. And he says, look, I'm not going to move from here until I reach nirvana. And that is where something interesting happens. And what happens is Mara, the evil one, appears to the Bodhisattva and sends his daughters to tempt the Bodhisattva to move his body, to give up his mission of trying to attain nirvana. His daughters start attacking him, and the daughters are representative of boredom, of greed, of desire. But when that all fails, the Mara offers him any worldly wishes and says, look, I will give it to you if you just go home and live a life of good karma, but you have to leave. But the Bodhisattva, again, the Bodhisattva is the Buddha, before he's attained nirvana, says, no, I don't want this. So then Mara goes, you know what? I sent my daughters that didn't work. I gave him the option to have anything in this world, and he still didn't comply. So then he sends his son, and his son represents anger. But still, the Bodhisattva is able to protect himself from this. And finally, Mara, the evil one, goes, I'm going to have a debate with you. And at this point in time, right, this is back 500 BC, the way a debate is determined is how loud the audience cheers for you. And so Mara, he has his daughters, he has his sons. So then when they're having this debate, Mara is winning. But at that point, the story goes, the Bodhisattva calls upon the earth for his support, and the earth sends an earthquake, and that's how it was determined that the Bodhisattva won. And so finally, when he defeats the Mara, the Bodhisattva is able to get into his own meditative practice. And his own meditative practice, as the story goes, was different from the practices at that point. The practice at that point was to draw yourself into levels of unconsciousness. But the Bodhisattva says, no, I'm going to do the opposite, because when he was a child, that's exactly what happened, right? He became more conscious, more aware of the things around him. And so then when he's sitting under this fig tree, he's just defeated Mara. He does the opposite, and he starts meditating to become more conscious. And it's at that point that he attains nirvana and becomes the Buddha. Now, when you understand the story, the whole of the Dhammapada makes much more sense, and why Mara keeps appearing, and why he says, look, you have to live a life that is not pleasure-seeking. You have to live a life that is not indolent, because if you do, then the evil one will win against you. And so the saying he has there is, the pleasure seeker who finds delight in physical object, whose senses are unsubdued, who is immoderate in eating, indolent and listless, him the evil one prevails against, as does the monsoon wind against a weak-rooted tree. Hence, the Buddha says you have to cultivate a strong mind. And he says, through diligence, vigilance, self-restraint, and subjugation of the senses, the wise aspirant makes an island for himself that no flood could engulf. He goes on to say, betake yourself not unto negligence, do not indulge in sensuous pleasures, for the vigilant and thoughtful aspirant acquires an amplitude of bliss. Vigilant among the heedless, wakeful among the sleeping ones, the wise man forges ahead, as a swift steed outstrips a horse of lesser strength. what you have to do to cultivate this mind is you have to be diligent in culling away the bad habits of letting your mind wander without any restraint. Clearly, one of the things in the Dhammapada is you must live a life of constraint. For us now, in this world, the idea of constraint seems like a prison. Why would you live a life of constraint? That seems like you are limiting yourself in your ability to enjoy more, in your ability to experience bliss. And this is the biggest lie that so many people get caught up in. And it's that a life without constraint is a life that's not worth living, because it is a life filled with unhappiness. Because if you live an unconstrained life, if you live a life that's not disciplined, essentially, you don't do the things you want to do, right? You don't do the things that are good for you. You do the things that your lower man decides what it wants. And your lower man is willing to kill you for it, because it is selfish. And this is something that the Buddha says, right? He says, as rust arising from iron straightway corrodes the very iron from which it arose, even so the evil deeds of the transgressor leads him to the state of woe. When you live an undisciplined life, and the discipline goes beyond physical discipline, it goes to mental discipline, it goes to spiritual discipline. He says the things that arise from your undisciplined life, and these are things that come up because the lower man controls you. The lower man is just like rust. He is you, but he is willing to kill you for it. One way to think about the lower man is, if you've ever seen The Lord of the Rings, if you've read The Lord of the Rings, the lower man is Gollum. Gollum is completely taken by the ring. The ring corrupts Gollum so much so that he becomes so selfish that he ends up killing his best friend, right? So Gollum is your lower man who has no inhibition, who has no discipline. And the truth is, the ring that Gollum is so entranced by represents your unbridled passion. And just as Gollum's life extended far beyond that of a normal hobbit by possessing the ring, if Gollum controls your life, right, your lower man controls your life, all your time will be squandered on trivial pleasures and overconsumption. Time will crumble around you and you'll live a meaningless life, which will be no different than if you were dead. The Gollum within you will never rest until and unless it is destroyed. He'll cause havoc by destroying your relationships, your passions, your talents, your friendship, and even your humanity. And that's why it's important to overcome your lower man. Going back to the Dhammapada, it's important to live a life of constraint, to live a life that's disciplined. So just as in Lord of the Rings, the ring gets destroyed in the fire of Mount Doom, you too must destroy your unbridled passions with Gollum. So you have to take that ring, just as Frodo took the ring to Mount Doom. You have to go there and you have to cast both the ring and Gollum into the fire. And specifically in the Dhammapada, the way to do this is to be vigilant of yourself, to be vigilant of your mind. Because the Buddha says vigilance is the path to immortality. Non-vigilance is the path to death. The vigilant do not die. The non-vigilant, though alive, are like unto the dead. And as I was going through this and reflecting on these verses, one of the things that came to me, and a note that I made, was from the previous episode with Epictetus, when Epictetus says, "Whoever then wishes to be free, let him neither wish for anything nor avoid anything which depends on others. If he does not observe this rule, he must be a slave." And for Epictetus, the most important thing is for you to control your mind, and for you not to be persuaded or influenced by the outside, and for you to be, one, detached from all these things, and also, secondly, to be disciplined in living your life. Staying on the importance of living a disciplined life, but specifically constraint. If you look at any craft, right? If you look at any craftsmanship, the whole practice, the whole craft requires constraint. If you look at piano, when you're trying to learn the piano, you are free to play whatever keys you want to play. You have no constraints, but you will not be able to create a beautiful tune playing whatever you want to play. You only are able to play beautiful tune when you are constrained. And the way to play beautiful music is through practice, through practicing discipline, self-discipline specifically, and understanding that there are certain notes that go with certain notes. There are certain structures that you must follow. And the same thing applies for any form of martial art. If you're practicing jiu-jitsu, one of the most important things is when you first learn it is that you must overcome your intuition to flail when you panic, right? Because when you're placed into positions that you've never been before and you're getting strangled, you want to get out as fast as possible, but you don't know how to get out, so you try to explode out. And sometimes that's when you have injuries. And to learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there are constraints, right? There are sequences that you must do to escape. There are sequences you must do to strangle, to break your opponent. And these sequences you must follow, because if you don't follow these things, you're not learning. And so to become really good at Jiu-Jitsu, like the one who gets the black belt, the martial artists who become very good, whether that's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, boxing, wrestling, are the ones who've lived a life of constraint, right? The ones who followed the path that has been laid out before them. They're not going about willy-nilly doing whatever comes to their mind. There is a structure to what they're doing. And your mind is no different than that. Your mind, if you do not have a structure for your mind, if you're not vigilant in what you allow your mind to ponder, your mind will wander so far and wide that when you actually sit down to pull your mind back to reality, it becomes very hard. It's not that it's impossible, but you'll realize that your mind has wandered too far. It'll take much more time and it'll be much more difficult to live a happy, meaningful life. You must control your mind. And so the Buddha says, the hedonist who seeks only the blossoms of sensual delights, whose mind is agitated, him the evil one brings under his sway, even before his carnal desires are satiated. Let the aspirant observe not the perversities of others, nor what others have and have not done. Rather, should he consider what he has done and what he has yet to do. And that last part, consider what he has done and what he has yet to do, is the reminder for us to say, at the end of the day, look at our lives and say, these are the things that I've done that are good, and these are the things that I've done that are bad, and these are the things that I need to improve upon. And it is this miniature reflection that you do daily that in the long run will have a huge impact on your life, a huge impact on where you are mentally. And especially as we're coming up to the end of the year here, I encourage you to take time to sit down, whether that's an hour, 3 hours, sit down, reflect on the past year, reflect on the past 5 years, reflect on the past 10 years, and see how you have lived your life. Whether the kind of life that you're living is the type of life that you want to continue pursuing, or is there a better path for you? And are there things in your life that you think are harming you more than they are doing any form of good? Do you have, as the Buddha says, hedonistic desires that are actually harming you in your pursuit of nirvana? He says, fear has he none, whose mind is not defiled by passion, whose heart is devoid of hatred, who has surpassed the dichotomy of good and evil, and who is vigilant. Do you have hatred in your heart? Is your mind defiled by passion, such that you are unable to focus on anything else? And something that the Buddha says is, the scent of sandalwood, the gara plant, and other fragrant things is of little account, whereas the aroma of the virtuous expands in a greater sphere, even up to the gods. The point that he's making here is, if you live a life of virtue, if you live a life of discipline, your life will have a much larger impact than you realize, because people will look at you and realize that they too must live a more virtuous life without you having to say anything. Because if you think about an aroma, when you smell something beautiful, you don't always know where it's coming from, but you can smell it. And just like that, the Buddha says that is how your life should be, where the good that you do, the virtuous things that you do, it will impact people that you don't even know are being impacted. So then how do we go about this? How do we go about living this sort of life? And for the Buddha, he says, he who is purged of all sensuality, firmly established in moral virtues, possessed of self-restraint and truthfulness, is indeed fit for the yellow robe. And the yellow robe here just means people who are monks, right? Because they wear saffron robes. He actually says, he who dons the yellow robe without even cleansing himself of sensuality, who is devoid of self-restraint and truthfulness, is indeed not fit for the yellow robe. And then it goes on to say, as the monsoon rain pierces through the roof of an ill-thatched house, so lust enters the undisciplined mind. And this reminded me of a quote from Epictetus from the manual, when Epictetus says, in walking about you take care not to step on a nail or to sprain your foot, so take care not to damage your own ruling faculty. If we observe this rule in every act, we shall undertake the act with more security. Very similar here, where for Epictetus he's saying you have to protect your mind just as you wear shoes when you're walking so you don't step on a nail. So too, your mind must be protected, otherwise you'll end up damaging your ruling faculty. And for the Buddha, he's saying where your mind is the roof. If that roof is not properly laid out, then when the monsoon rain comes, the roof will leak and it will penetrate into the house and destroy the house. And so lust, he says, will enter the undisciplined mind, and lust will end up destroying you because lust spreads like a virus. I was surprised at how much lust came up in the Dhammapada, and how often the Buddha said to attain nirvana, you must overcome lust. When you're reading Matthew, Jesus has this very famous line, and he says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." There is quite a lot of similarities between Jesus' teaching in Matthew and the sayings of the Buddha in the Dhammapada. And that I found fascinating, because here you have two teachers from two different sides of the world who've had a tremendous impact on the world. And when you're reading their sayings, there's so much similarities in terms of principle of how you should live an ethical life. To live an ethical life, you know that it must be practiced, that you must have skin in the game, that you must take the risk for the beliefs that you have, right? If you claim to be disciplined, but you're unable to wake up at the time that you say you want to wake up, that is not living a life that is in line with what you claim to be. And so you must live a life that is in line with what you preach. So practice what you preach. And the Buddha has something to say around here. He says, like unto a lovely flower which is exquisite in color, yet lacking in fragrance, even so prove futile the well-spoken words of a man who acts not up to them. And he also says, a heedless man, though he utters much of the canon, but does not act accordingly, is like unto a cowherd who counts the cattle of others. He is verily not a sharer of the fruit of the monastic life. The point that he's making here is there's a difference between somebody who speaks these words, who's able to recite beautiful passages from the Dhammapada, beautiful passages from the Bible, beautiful passages from the Quran, whatever it is, and somebody who actually practices these things. It is more excellent to love God than to know Him. And that is something for us to remember generally, whether you are a person of faith or not. It is better to practice what you preach and not be able to explain full well why it is that you're doing what you're doing, versus somebody who can tell you the intricacies of this philosophy and this ethical framework. But then when you look at their life is absolute garbage. Their life, as Tolstoy says, is no different than somebody who's already dead. And that's one thing that Tolstoy hates in Confession. He says, all of my friends, right, all of them know that their life is meaningless. They've told me that life is meaningless. And they all know that to live is no different than to die. But none of them are willing to take that path of death. They have no skin in the game. For you and I, we have to make sure that we are men and women who practice what we preach, who's willing to be seen as fools because of the practices that we have, the rituals that we do. Because we know that in committing to these rituals, in being faithful to what we believe in having conviction in these things, we will live a life that's meaningful. We will live a life that's virtuous. We will live a life that's happy. And according to the Buddha, you are on the path to nirvana. So the Buddha says, a man, though he recites only a little of the canon, but acts according to the precepts of the sacred law, who having got rid of lust, hatred, and delusion, has firmly established himself in liberated thought, and clinging to no worldly possessions here or the hereafter, such a one becomes indeed a sharer of the true fruit of the monastic life. So for you and I, as the year draws closer to an end, we have to reflect on this past year to see, have I lived a life that is consistent, practicing what I preach? There will always be gaps. You will never be perfect in this world. But in the act of reflecting, in the act of being aware of what it is that you're doing, you are already miles ahead. You can never have too much self-control. You can never have too much self-discipline. There's a growing reaction to this world of discipline and self-discipline where people are saying, no, you have to live a life. You have to be more relaxed about the rules in your life. For some, this is true, right? You do not want to live a life of extreme. That's something that the Buddha ends up rejecting, because he goes from living a life of complete indulgence where he's living in kingdom. He has everything that he wants. He's never seen suffering. And when he sees suffering, he rejects all of his material possessions, runs away, goes into the forest, lives a life of extreme ascetic practices, not eating, not drinking to attain nirvana. So now you have these two extremes that you're seeing in the life of the Buddha, right? Overindulgence on the one side and overindulgence on the other side. Too much food on one, too little food on one. Too much water on one, too little water on the other. Too much pleasure on the one, no pleasure at all. And what he ends up getting to is he ends up getting to the middle way. And that's what Buddhism is sometimes known as. It's known as the middle path or the middle way. And you and I know that a life that's worth living is a life in moderation, right? The virtues are the middle of two extremes. As we talked about before, courage is the middle between being too brash and being too cowardly. Wisdom is the middle path between foolishness and ignorance. Same with compassion. Compassion is the middle path between cruelty and indifference. And so too, in the teachings of the Buddha, is the path of the middle way. When you are practicing self-control, make sure it is not to the extreme where you end up damaging yourself. Make sure you find a way to do the middle. So especially as you start to think about the end of the year, if you're thinking about New Year's resolution, I encourage you not to go to the extreme. If you've never worked out before, don't say, I'm going to work out 7 days a week. Start small. Say, I'll work out for 5 minutes once every 2 days. Something small. If you've never woken up early in the morning, don't say, I'll wake up at 4 in the morning and not be able to keep that practice for the remainder of the year. Right? These are extremes. You can always work your way backwards. Right? You can always start small. If you know you have a problem with overeating, don't go to the extreme and say, I'll cut my food down to 1 meal a day. And for the majority of people, it's always better to practice moderation. And moderation, if you have a problem with overeating, is okay. I will not eat desserts at 9 p.m. or 10:30 right before I go to bed. So the Buddha says, the fool who knows of his ignorance, indeed, through that very consideration becomes a wise man. But that conceited fool who considers himself learned is in fact called a fool. This fits very well with what we're talking about, because in the simple fact of realizing and considering your past actions that may have been foolish, in the very act of reflecting on this, you become a wise man. But you will remain a fool if you consider yourself learned, meaning you consider yourself as somebody who does not need to learn anymore. And that's why you and I are reading these books every week. We're reading these books so that we are wholly aware until the very day we die, until our very last breath, we can always learn something. Because you and I only live for a maximum of 100, maybe 110 years if you're very good. But even then, until the very last breath, there is always something to learn, because you and I are just a blip in human history. And that's why reading these books, especially books from 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago, are very helpful, because these guys have gone and walked the path before us. And so we have the privilege of reading their works, taking in their wisdom, and seeing how we can apply this to our lives. If they've made mistakes, then we want to avoid those mistakes. If they have great advice, great wisdom, just like in the Dhammapada from Buddha, we want to make sure we implement those in our lives. And I think one of the most important things for me that I've realized over the years is nobody has a monopoly on truth. No person, no group, no institution, no religion has a monopoly on truth. Truth is not a slave to anybody. And that's important to emphasize, because we're going through all these books, and the books that we're going through are going to come from all walks of life. And if you are stuck in this idea that truth only exists in, say, Stoic philosophy, you will limit yourself in what you know and limit yourself in the truth that you can attain, because you are myopic in your view of truth. This example can be extended to all other religions as well, all other sages that you might know. Nobody has a monopoly on truth. And I think once you realize this, you are able to enjoy the vast array of human wisdom, human knowledge. But if you're caught up in it, you might just be stuck in a particular field. If you are somebody who believes that truth is only found in Western traditions, then you will only read works of the Western tradition and never find the beauty, the wisdom that's in the Dhammapada. Or if you're somebody in the East who believes that only the Eastern philosophies have truth, you will never come across the works of Aristotle. You will never come across the works of Plato, right? You'll be stuck in only reading Eastern philosophy. Precisely because we don't want to do this, we want to make sure that we expand our mind, expand our consciousness, and not be limited. It's important to not judge quickly others and the works of other traditions. Judge what they say. There are people who believe that certain groups, certain people have the monopoly on truth. And anything that doesn't come from this tradition is all wrong. And I think this limits you in what you can learn. Now I want to move on to something that for the Buddha is very, very important. As I mentioned before, for him there are things that are evil, there are things that are immoral that will prevent you from attaining nirvana. And there are a few sayings that I want to bring up here. So the first one is, the unwise, fools who are enemies to themselves, go about committing sinful deeds which produce bitter fruits. As fresh drawn milk from the cow does not soon curdle, so an evil deed does not produce immediate fruits. It follows the wrongdoer like a smoldering spark that burns throughout and suddenly blazes up. So he says, do not keep company with evil-doing friends, nor with people who are base. Associate with the good, associate with the best of men. A side note here, base here doesn't mean what the modern term is currently being used here. Base here refers to somebody who only thinks about their base desires, who's controlled by their lower man. So the quote around the fresh drawn milk I think is quite insightful, because there are things that you do which you won't see the consequences of immediately. But if you continue to do these things, if you continue to do evil acts, ultimately they will come through, they will burn you, and suddenly everything will catch on fire because the evil acts that you've been doing has been compounding. And that's what the Buddha is trying to get at. Now, the Buddha says, one day's life of an arhat. An arhat is somebody who has achieved nirvana but is not the Buddha. One day's life of an arhat who is virtuous and contemplative is better than 100 years of a life of one who is dissolute and of controlled mind. It goes on to say, the self is the master of the self. Who else can be that master? With the self fully subdued, one obtains a sublime refuge, which is very difficult to achieve. And the note that I made here is, it is better to live a short life that is filled with discipline, a life that is filled with virtue, than a long life that is mediocre and filled with vices, uncontrolled, undisciplined. Because of those two lives, even if you lived a short life but you lived a virtuous life, you will be happy. Do not get caught up in this idea of being full of emotions, of being joyful. But happiness here is bliss. Right? It is better to live a short life filled with virtues, filled with discipline, which will lead to living a blissful life. No matter the amount of material possessions you have in a life filled with vices, it is nothing compared, as the Buddha says, nothing compared to one day's life of an arhat who is virtuous and contemplative. A saying that I really liked in the Dhammapada is this: health is the greatest of gifts, contentment the greatest of riches, trust is the finest of relationships, and nirvana the highest bliss. Health, as we already talked about in terms of the year coming to an end, health, the Buddha says, is the greatest of gifts. Right? If you have all the riches but have no health, you always want to be healthy. Think of the last time you were sick. The last time you were sick, you didn't want more money, you didn't want more material possessions, you just wanted to get healthy. Contentment, the greatest of riches. The reason contentment is the greatest of riches is because you know when enough is enough. And if you don't know when enough is enough for you, nothing will ever satisfy you. And if nothing ever satisfies you, that means you will never be happy. And for the Buddha, you will never reach nirvana. Trust is the finest of relationships. The reason betrayal is such a horrible and unloving thing to do is because it breaches the trust between two friends or two lovers. And finally, nirvana, the highest bliss. Of all these things, nirvana is the highest bliss because you can still attain nirvana without the health. You could be sick, you could be missing limbs, but you can still attain nirvana. And so I want to end with two sayings. The first is, he who controls his rising anger as a skilled driver curbs a rolling chariot. Him I call a true chariot. Others merely hold the rein. And finally, though one were to conquer 1,000,000 men in battle, the man who conquers himself is the greater victor. And with that, I'll wrap. I highly recommend getting this book, Dhammapada. I've put the Amazon link below, so just check the show notes. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe and leave a review on Spotify, on Apple, wherever you're listening to. And also, if there's somebody in your life that you think this podcast will be helpful to, share it with them. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome to email me, ij@becomingantifragile.com. Till next week, peace.